This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is part 2 of my series over Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. At one time, Lincoln County was the largest county in the entire United States. Although New Mexico was a territory at the time and not a state, Lincoln County took up nearly a quarter of the territory of New Mexico, and it contained 30,000 square miles. It was practically the entire southeast quarter of the state. Prior to the Civil War, it was the land of the Apaches, the Mescaleros to be exact. They were a group I didn't really talk about too much in my Apache series. They got the occasional passing mention. I did highlight the Mescaleros in the Civil War series when the Confederates briefly occupied Fort Stanton, a place that'll be very important in this story. Kit Carson would be stationed at Fort Stanton after the rebels' retreat down the Rio Grande, and he and his New Mexicans would finally pacify the Mescaleros. Well, the brief stint at the abysmal Bosque Redondo also helped pacify the Mescaleros. Once the Apaches returned, the Fort Stanton, would stay garrisoned, both to keep the Apaches pacified and to keep settlers from poaching Mescalero land and animals. Fort Stanton was basically a buffer. The fort was 9 miles west of the county seat, a town known as Lincoln. Many of the well-off ranchers around the town of Lincoln fed the fort and the Apaches. It was a lucrative deal, if you could cut it and stay alive. After the Civil War, New Mexican Hispanics began to settle the now free of Indians territory that would become Lincoln County. There may have been up to 2,000 people in the whole county in the 1870s when this story begins. But there were tens of thousands of heads of cattle. The county has now been broken up into 3. Now, obviously, Lincoln County and Lincoln the town were named after the President of the United States of the same name. It was created in 1869, and the county seat at that time was, like I just mentioned, the town of Lincoln. And Lincoln sits north of the Sacramento Mountains and south of the Capitan Mountains. A lot of the towns that will be discussed in this story from here on out are in this enormous piece of land, which includes deserts, towering mountains, white sand dunes, black volcanic lands, prairies, rivers, and parts of the Llano Estacado. The eastern portion of the county was basically ran by a man named John Chisholm, and he helped to establish the Goodnight-Chisholm Trail, which was along the Pecos River. Chisholm had come to New Mexico from Texas in 1868, and he had snatched an enormous amount of land. John Chisholm, you could call him a cattle baron. Chisholm has a fantastic Western-style mustache curled at the ends. He was a powerful man, with a lot of land, and he will be very important to the story as I tell it. So over in Lincoln County, around the time that Henry was lingering near Silver City after he killed the blacksmith and fled Arizona, on September 18th, 1877, a rustling band known as the Boys, led by a small and seemingly evil man named Jesse Evans, the Boys and Jesse Evans stole some horses from three men that are incredibly important to this story. Those men are Dick Brewer, Alexander McSween, and the Englishman John Tunstall. The following day, after his horses were stolen, McSween would write a letter to the Mesilla Valley Independent, and he would say, quote, well, before I tell you his quote, every time I read a quote from McSween, I always read it in my mind as being Brian Cox. And Brian Cox is that actor from Scotland who was in Braveheart and the Bourne movies, X-Men 2, and he was a possibly superior Dr. Hannibal Lecter from the movie Manhunter by Michael Mann. So, because McSween is a Scot, well, he's not from Scotland, but he was born in Canada. I'll tell you about his story later, but he is basically a Scotsman. So every time I think of Alexander McSween, I think of like a younger Brian Cox. Just had to put that in there for y'all. And no, I won't be attempting his accent. So McSween wrote a letter to the Mesilla Valley Independent, which is owned by a man I will talk about because he is also a very important character of this entire story. But he wrote a letter and it said, quote, "This forenoon, my horses and those of Mr. Tunstall were stolen from a ranch on the Rio Ruidoso, Dick Brewer's. I valued my horses at $700. Tunstall's cost over $1,000. Two of mine were fine American horses. Among Tunstall's were one of the handsomest team of mules in this section of the country. Good citizens are in pursuit of the thieves, and I hope they will overtake them and plunder. For the recovery of these animals, we will pay a liberal reward. The thieves were seen driving off the animals. The boys are known." End quote. These horse thieves, the boys, took their loot and headed across the beautiful Sacramento Mountains, where Ruidoso sits today, as well as the Mescalero Apache Res. They then went down into the hot and gorgeous Tularosa Basin. The wide and flat basin of Tularosa holds the famous White Sands and the White Sands Missile Range. Oh, yeah, and the Trinity site, where they detonated the first atomic bomb. One of the men who had his horses stolen was the aforementioned Dick Brewer. He would hire two friends, men who will also be very important to this story, future Regulators, Charlie Beaudry and Josiah Gordon, Doc Skurlock. The three of them were then in hot pursuit. But eventually they would split up. Dick Brewer, he would go into the once capital of Confederate Arizona, Mesilla, and there he would ask the sheriff to please have the men he knew who did it arrested. He told the sheriff it was the boys, it was Jesse Evans. The sheriff of Doñana County, his name at that time was Mariano Barela, and he had no desire to help Brewer in any way whatsoever. Even after 3 days, and even after being told exactly where the thieves were, the sheriff was not interested. The boys, under Evans, they were hiding out on the opposite side of the basin under the Oregon Mountains, and they were at a place called Warren F. Shedd's Ranch. If you haven't been to the Oregon Mountains, if you ever go, there is a wonderful trail known as Dripping Springs. And from that trail, you can see the Sacramento Mountains on the other side to the east, and Sierra Blanca among them. You can see the White Sands. You can see the Organ Pipe Mountains behind you. You can even see the long runway where the Space Shuttle Columbia landed in 1982. Jesse Evans, he was short. He was an inch or two shorter than Billy the Kid. But he was 145 pounds, a lot heavier than Henry. Jesse was 7 years older than Henry, and he had gray eyes and light hair. Jesse may have been from Arkansas or Missouri, Texas, or Kansas. It is very unclear. I read all of those states. His family may have had a counterfeit money ring at one point. It's just tough to pin down. It is known he eventually came to New Mexico in 1872, and he worked not only for the cattleman John Chisholm, but he also worked for the King Rustler of New Mexico, a man named John Kinney, who was known as Boss Rustler Kinney. Jesse Evans would take Chisholm's cattle across the mountains and the desert, and then the mountains again, and sell them to John Kinney, the Boss Rustler, north of Mesilla and Las Cruces along the Rio Grande. Chisholm was no fan of Evans, or rustlers in general. So here's a little background on Jesse Evans and John Kinney, the Boss Rustler. On New Year's Eve, 1875, so 2 years prior to this stealing of Brewer's, Tunstall's, and McSween's horses, Jesse Evans and John Kinney, the Boss Rustler, and 2 other banditos got into a fist fight with a few soldiers from Fort Selden. And Fort Selden is north of Las Cruces and Mesilla. These 4 rustlers ended up getting the crap beat out of them at this New Year's Eve dance by the soldiers. Well, later that night, these 4 men would return to the dance, and they would fire indiscriminately towards the soldiers. Well, and their dates and everyone there. One soldier would die after taking a bullet to the forehead. A random New Mexican would also die. And another soldier would die from the earlier fist fight from internal bleeding. And yet, still 3 other soldiers received bullet wounds. The local authorities and the local sheriff, the very same Mariano Barela, they all refused to do anything about the shooting and the beating. And the 4 men, which included Jesse Evans and John Kinney, Boss Rustler, they were never apprehended. And then, only 19 days after this New Year's Eve shooting, Jesse Evans struck again when he and 2 others gunned down a man on the main street of Las Cruces. Again, Sheriff Barela did nothing. Although this was apparently a revenge killing, since the man that died had killed a friend of Barela, the sheriff, and the very important group I'll get into shortly. So the powers that be were, including the law and the sheriff, they were protecting these horse and cattle thieves, who also dabbled in murder. Eventually, by 1877, the founder of the Mesilla Valley Independent newspaper that I mentioned earlier, Albert Jennings Fountain, he will come up a lot, Fountain took up a personal crusade against Evans and the boys. The boys in their reign of terror that they had overseen during the past 2 years in southern New Mexico. On July 14, 1877, Bastille Day, Fountain, in his paper, issued a challenge to the outlaws and to Evans himself. He wrote, quote, "There are 12 of you, And if room cannot be found for you in the Dolan County Jail, 12 ropes and 12 cottonwood limbs can be found. You have adroitly succeeded thus far in frustrating the earnest efforts of the district attorney and other officers of the law to bring you to justice. You cannot escape swift retribution of an outraged community. We warn you to beware. End quote. Evans did not take this challenge lying down, and he threatened to kill the newspaperman Fountain if he ever saw him right there on site. He actually said he'd give Fountain, quote, a free pass to hell. End quote. Eventually, the ineffectual sheriff, ineffectual on account of his bosses, he was forced to create a posse of 40 men, and they rode out into Boss Russell Kinney's ranch, which is only 3 miles north of Mesilla. This posse's plan was to apprehend the men. But of course the banditos, the whole lot of them, they had all been warned and they had fled. With, of course, their stolen loot and all their animals. They had fled east across the pass through the Oregon Mountains and then through the White Sands, through Alamogordo to La Rosa, and into the Sacramento Mountains. While they rode, they stole 13 more horses. Most of these were from the Mescalero Apaches. They then continued through the mountains. They passed Ruidoso and future Ruidoso Downs. They went down the Hondo Valley and then down the Pecos River to a place known as Seven Rivers. Seven Rivers isn't anything now, but it is south of Roswell, south of Artesia, and north of Carlsbad. It is just off the Pecos River. Importantly, this area, Seven Rivers, is still in Lincoln County, not Dolan County. And Dolan County is where Mesilla and Las Cruces are. For 2 months, the gang of Boss Russell Kinney and Jesse Evans hid out in Seven Rivers. Now, they would only be here for 2 months, but they would inevitably return, and they would eventually form something called the Seven Rivers Boys. But for now, for 2 months, the outlaws hung out at Seven Rivers. At least until they stole the horses from the 3 men I introduced the episode with: Brewer, McSween, and Tunstall. So now, we are caught up to the beginning of the episode. The boys and Jesse Evans and Boss Russell Kinney. These are the kinds of men Brewer, Beaudry, and Doc Scurlock were up against when they rode to Shed's ranch to get back Brewer's, Tunstall's, and McSween's animals. These were murderers and thieves that had the backing of powerful people, the most powerful people in New Mexico. Yet the 3 men were undeterred. And so they headed for the ranch, Shed's ranch, to demand the horses back. Despite them being outnumbered and the threat of being killed, they did not want to leave empty-handed. At Shed's ranch, Brewer confronted Evans in what must have been quite the tense scene, and Brewer ordered Evans to hand over the stolen animals. Here's how author Matthews, George R. Matthews, sums up what happened next. Quote, Evans refused, but, apparently admiring Brewer's audacity, told Brewer he could have his own horses. Brewer replied, quote, if you can't give me the Englishmen's, Tunstall's, you can keep them and go to hell. End all quotes. Eventually, the 3, Doc Scurlock and Beaudry and Brewer, they left empty-handed. but at least they left with their lives. As the three of them were heading back to the other side of the Sacramento Mountains, other side of the Tularosa Basin to the Sacramento Mountains, they ran into two of Tunstall, the Englishman's men. One of these men decided to continue back with them, while the other, Robert Weidenman, decided to head to Mesilla to see what he could do. Weidenman, another future regulator, is a name I will mention a lot. Meanwhile, Evans and his 11 boys took their stolen loot and headed through the San Augustine Pass, which is where Major Lind had surrendered to Baylor. They then headed down into the Rio Grande Valley. 3 of Evans' men, though, decided to have a quick side quest where they stole 2 more horses. One belonged to a New Mexican and one belonged to an Anglo-American. The nearby constable was then summoned to retrieve these 2 horses and arrest the thieves. He gathered 5 men for the job, and the 6 of them gave chase. But the chase was short-lived. The 12 Evans men, the boys, they had Winchester rifles, and the 6 lawmen had only pistols. About 40 bullets were fired at the posse in rapid succession from 300 yards away, which was then followed by taunts that filled the air. The lawmen had to head back home after that. By Friday, September 28th, 10 days after the initial horse theft from Brewer, McSween, and Tunstall, Evans and the boys had traveled far enough west to be 12 miles south of Silver City. You see where I'm going with this. They even traveled not too far from the Knight Ranch, the ranch of the butcher and his wife, where the school teacher and her husband were staying. The ranch that Billy the Kid had briefly hid out in. The boys went to Arizona, sold their loot, returned to New Mexico, this time around or about 16 miles southwest of Silver City, where they stole 3 more horses. They then rode east into the famous from my Apache series, Cook's Canyon. While in the canyon, a rider from Silver City saw the banditos, and he saw that within their ranks was a boy that this rider recognized from his town of Silver City. That boy was Henry McCarty, going by Henry Antrim now, a.k.a. future Billy the Kid. He was now amongst the boys. This man who saw Henry, a Mr. Carpenter, he would not only tell the local newspaper about seeing the kid, but he'd also tell the sheriff, that same Sheriff Whitehill. Whitehill immediately telegrammed Mesilla and told that sheriff there, Mariano Barela, that the thieves Barela failed to apprehend earlier were heading his way yet again, and that a known escaped convict, now wanted for murder in Arizona, was with them. So Henry the Kid had fled Silver City and had joined Evans and the boys, and he was a little in over his head. Evans, the boys, and the kid, they all then headed east in a leisurely manner. They stopped and drank whiskey and liberated bottles of amber from the many taverns they visited. They held up a stagecoach, only to find the driver had nothing of value. So they forced him to drink whiskey and then sent him on his way. They would continue to hit up every tavern they came to. And there they drank the best of whiskey, and then they refused, at the point of a gun, to pay any tab. They said, quote unquote, chalk it up. Now, news of all this reached the newspaper man Fountain, and he would print sarcastically, quote, the distinguished Captain Evans and the prominent citizens, the boys, whose recent exploits have added so much to our reputation as a peaceable and law-abiding community, are now peaceably enjoying the fruits of their recent labors somewhere in this vicinity. We shall probably hear of them again. End quote. News of their arrival had spread, so they couldn't stay too long near Mesilla. but they did stop by Boss Rustler's place and sold him the horses they'd stolen, since selling their horses that they'd stolen in Arizona. As author Matthews suggests, they also introduced the King of Rustlers to Billy the Kid. With this new group, Billy no doubt had to do something to show that he fit in. He was one of them. He always did, and he always will. So he probably had no clue of Fountain's vendetta against the Banditos, which is why he made this very reckless next move. One night, in early October of 1877, the Kid slipped out of the Boss Rustler's ranch, slipped into Las Cruces, and stole a horse. But not just any horse. He stole Sheriff Barrela's daughter's horse. Although he didn't know it was her horse, he and Jesse Evans and Boss Rustler, they would all find out that news later, and it would surprise them. By the 8th of October, Evans, the boys, and Billy the Kid, although he wasn't known by that quite yet, well, they all left Boss Rustler's ranch in the Rio Grande Valley and headed east. On their trek west, they stopped at one point at the small town of Tularosa, where they got really drunk in a quote-unquote big drink, and then they, quote, fired 100 or more shots promiscuously about the town as a parting salute, end quote. From Tularosa, the gang continued into the Sacramento Mountains, where they stole a bunch of stuff from the Mescalero trading post. Finally, they rendezvoused with 2 Lincoln County businessmen whom were allies to the boys. These men, prominent men, were John Riley, no relation, and Jim Longwell. Riley was a partner with another important man in this story, a man named James J. Dolan. Dolan had a ranch, and he had no problem buying stolen cattle from the boys. You see, Dolan had a contract with both the Army and the Mescalero Reservation to deliver them beef. And Dolan needed that beef. The boys helped provide said beef. Dolan never asked where the beef came from, but he knew. Dolan and his action known as the House, John Riley, Dick Brewer, Weidenman, Beaudry, Skurlock, Evans, the boys, Billy the Kid, McSween, and Tunstall, these are all key players. And there are more, but these are the key men in the brewing, deadly feud that was about to erupt. The feud known as the Lincoln County War. The king of the Pecos River cattlemen was John Chisholm, not to be confused with Chisholm, as in the Chisholm Trail. Chisholm's ranch and land spread some 150 miles up and down the Pecos River. The Pecos River is where I caught my first trout on a fly line. It's also the same river that starts in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains just north of Glorieta Pass. And Glorieta Pass is where a man named Hugh Beckwith used to have a ranch. Hugh Beckwith, like the lawman Pat Garrett, was born in Alabama in the 1840s. But he'd come to New Mexico and married a New Mexican woman from high society. When the rebels invaded during the war, he was elated, as he was a Southern man. During the brief conflict I talked about not so briefly, Beckwith supplied beef to the rebels in whatever capacity he could. But we know how that ended. The burning of the wagon train west of Glorieta Pass forced the Confederates south to Texas on their long and arduous march. Carleton of the California Column, he then became military governor supreme and hunted down any Southern sympathizers. So Beckwith and his family fled with the rebels south to El Paso. That is until tensions eased and he moved first to Lincoln, which must have stung a little bit with the name. And then he moved from Lincoln to just north of the aforementioned Seven Rivers, pretty much near future Roswell. Seven Rivers didn't actually have seven rivers, but it had seven springs which flowed into the Pecos River. And it was here that Beckwith set up a ranch on the east side of the river at the base of the Llano Estacado. And then he began to rival the king of the Pecos, John Chisholm. But everyone in the land knew that, quote, no one could live in Seven Rivers who did not steal from Chisholm's range, end quote. Beckwith, besides possibly stealing a few errant cattle from Chisholm, he also gave sanctuary to the occasional outlaws like Evans and the boys. This was also not a secret. So when the sheriff realized his daughter's prized horse was stolen, Barela sent word to Beckwith demanding his daughter's horse back. By the time the boys and the kid arrived to Beckwith's, word had already reached the southern gentleman of the stolen prized horse. When Evans heard who the horse had belonged to, he got rather upset. He told the kid, who later reported, quote, Jesse has a stand-in over there, Las Cruces, with some of the officers, and you have to let their stuff alone, end quote. So these thieves were in with the law, which should be obvious by now. The sheriff, according to the kid's own words, was going to kill the thief if the horse was not brought back. The problem was, the kid had sold the horse on their journey east of Ruidoso Downs on the Hondo River. He sold it to a man named Frank McCullum. That meant the kid had to go back up into the mountains, get the horse, and then take said horse to the sheriff all the way over in Las Cruces, which is a long and arduous journey. Well, to make his new friends happy, off he went, all alone. And it was October 13th, 1877. And this little journey would prove rather fortuitous for Henry the Kid. Frank McCullum, he told the kid that, look, I'm sorry, I sold it. And rather than pursuing the horse further down the transaction line, the kid just gave up and he headed back to Beckwith's ranch. But much to his surprise, Evans and 3 others had been arrested in his absence by the Lincoln County Deputy Constable, the aforementioned Dick Brewer, future leader of the Regulators, briefly. And he was also one of the 3 men who had his horses stolen in the beginning of this Lincoln County story. And then another fortuitous event occurred. The kid stayed at the Beckwith Ranch for about a week after his return. And much to his surprise, while he was there, a family showed up with the mare that he'd stolen. The family were, I hesitate to say a bunch of cattle rustlers, but their name was the Caseys. And that's an unfair title, and I'll talk about their history briefly in the next episode. But unfortunately for the kid, he could not convince anyone in the household, the Casey household, to sell him the mare he needed desperately to return to the sheriff if he ever wanted to get back in with Evans and the boys. Dejected, the kid no doubt headed to the local saloon, probably to scheme on some way of getting that mare back, maybe waiting until dark, sneaking into the ranch and taking off with the horse, like he'd done in the first place. But while at the cantina, or at least while in the small town of Seven Rivers, the kid met the aforementioned Deputy Dick Brewer and 6 of his men. They were now, after having caught Evans and 3 of his men, they were now in hot pursuit of the Caseys and their recently stolen cattle. Cattle that belonged to Brewer's boss, the also aforementioned Englishman John Tunstall. During this meeting between Brewer and Henry, it seems Brewer gave the kid a job at one of he and Tunstall's ranches in the Pecos River Valley. And Henry gladly accepted it. He no longer had to be an outlaw. He no longer had to worry about that horse he stole. Brewer obviously had no idea that Henry had briefly been in with the boys, and I'm sure Henry did not offer that information either. But little did Henry know that by taking this job, he was about to step into the Lincoln County War, and his boss, whom he had not met yet, John Tunstall, will play a significant part in its early stages. At 19 years old, in 1872, John Tunstall left England for British Columbia in Canada. He was there to learn his father's business, but after 3.5 years, John grew bored and realized that he was not welcome. Apparently the partners were wanting to buy his dad out. So John ventured southward to the United States. His goal was to raise sheep, which is very British, and he wanted to do that in California, specifically the San Francisco Bay Area. Unfortunately for him, though, the area was all played out. All the land was already taken. He had nowhere to graze the herd he had yet to acquire. But while there in California, he was told, at least this is what he wrote his father, John Partridge Tunstall. John Tunstall Jr. wrote a lot of letters to his father, which we have and are great. But he wrote his father and said he was told, quote, "New Mexico is a place for you. Just you jump right in, buy up all the land you can, start your sheep, and turn every cent you make into Spanish grants. New Mexico today is just where California was 10 years ago. New Mexico is a better sheep farming country than California can be. The labor is cheaper, and the country the best in the world, I believe, for sheep. You can go there, learn all about sheep, and look out for a location at the same time. And if you can get hold of any money to secure your range, in 10 years' time, you can be as rich as a prince." End quote. And this reminds me of the Pleasant Valley War episode, because the people in northern Arizona did not like sheep herders, and the people in New Mexico didn't much care for them either. And the Pleasant Valley War, I talked about that. I've talked about the Civil War, the Anasazi Civil War, the Spanish and Indian Wars, the Apache versus everyone, and now the Lincoln County War, and pretty soon the Mexican-American War. It seems my podcast mostly focuses on war. So Tunstall, he was unable to raise sheep in California, and by October of 1876, he was in Santa Fe. While in that beautiful city, he was staying at a certain Hurlow's Hotel, ironically on San Francisco Street. While at this hotel, he met a fellow guest named Alexander McSween. Alexander McSween was an attorney from Canada, although clearly of Scottish descent. He went to law school in Missouri for 1 year before making his way to Kansas, as seemingly every Anglo did, before going even further west. In Kansas, he got married, and not long afterwards, 1875, he and his wife were in Lincoln County, where he was in the employ of the aforementioned James Dolan as an attorney. Although in the employ of is kind of unjust, because McSween was basically the only attorney around. Gardner, in To Hell on a Fast Horse, describes McSween like this, quote, "McSween, a Scotsman 10 years Tunstall senior, was new to the territory as well, having arrived with his wife Susan in March of 1875. With a drooping mustache as thick as his Scottish brogue, McSween had initially worked as a lawyer for the house, where he got an insider's look into the firm's many business dealings." End quote. So again, he was born in Canada, and so he was of Scottish descent, not really a Scotsman himself. But since he was the only lawyer in town, well, not only in town, but seemingly in the entire county, he was quite popular. Popular for business. So it isn't fair to say he worked for Dolan and Murphy, aka the house. And Dolan and Murphy are names I will dive into more in a bit. He may not have worked for them, but he certainly was on retainer for a time for the house. In Maurice G. Fulton's 1968 book, History of the Lincoln County War, Fulton says of McSween, quote, known as a high-priced lawyer who usually gave value received by winning his cases, he had the knack of finding some strategy or technicality that would enable him to turn the tables on the opposing side. He had high professional ideals and did not hesitate to decline cases he felt were not just. And a sincere interest in bringing law and order into his section made him observant of the corruption overspreading the area. End quote. As Fulton points out, the corruption of the area was rampant, and the House was leading it. And McSween planned on doing something about it. McSween also grew close to John Chisholm around this time, and he worked out quite a few legal matters for the man, the powerful man. So if you were wondering, I am indeed sympathetic to Tunstall, McSween, and the Regulators, and I am opposed to the Republican-led Santa Fe Ring and their offshoot, the House. And at this time, I'm sympathetic to the kid. McSween was at that present moment when he met Tunstall in Santa Fe. He was making the long journey to New York City. He was going over there to receive funds from a life insurance policy that was to be paid to the beneficiaries of a man named Fritz. And more on him soon. Although McSween would receive the funds, he would not get to pay that money out to the Fritz's beneficiaries. And this check would be the largest fuel to the flames of the Lincoln County War. This simple life insurance check that was owed to a founding member of the Lincoln County House, it would be maybe not the largest fuel to the flames, but the biggest spark to start the flames. But in Santa Fe, Tunstall told McSween of his dream of raising sheep. And McSween said something to the effect of, "Oh, I can help you with that down in Lincoln County. It's perfect country for livestock, but a word of advice, the people there don't like sheep. You'd be better off going into the cattle business." How right McSween was. Although, well, we'll get there. McSween told Tunstall, "Why don't you take a ride back to Lincoln County with my friend Juan Patron? 'Cause I gotta head east." Tunstall, excited at finally being able to run a business of his own, he accepted. He already trusted McSween, and he wrote his father about him. He said of McSween, quote, "There is a very nice young fellow here just now from Lincoln County, a lawyer by profession, who has the outward appearance of an honest man." End quote. How right he was in that observation. The ride for Tunstall from Santa Fe to Lincoln County, it took 4 days. But they seemed to be 4 days that the Englishman enjoyed, for the most part. He also enjoyed Patron's company, and he told his father, quote, "Patron is a very good sort of fellow, and the best educated Mexican I have met." He continues, "He is quite intelligent and appears to have good principles and certainly is kind-hearted." End quote. Juan Patron will also feature heavily in this series. Now, while all of what Tunstall said about Patron may be true, Tunstall also wrote his father about how horrible of a wagon driver Patron was. This was the part he did not enjoy. He wrote, quote, "It was nothing short of agony to me to sit and watch him drive, or rather hold the reins, for no one could call it driving." End quote. Now, it didn't help that a snowstorm had blown through the region and had left the road like, quote, "so much pudding." End quote. He told his father that poor Patron, quote, "never availed himself of the solid parts of the road, but went right along in the ruts and mud, when half the strength of the horses would have been saved by driving 12 inches to the right or left. His reins always hung down, touching the pole in such a way that he had no command of his team." End quote. It's the New Mexican way, really. People still drive like that here. Part of Patron's problem was that just a year prior to this, he had been shot through the back. The bullet only missed his spine by a half an inch. And the bullet didn't come out of the front of him. Rather, it was taken out by surgery, because it stopped only half an inch from his skin, which is gnarly stuff. But it goes to show the violence of the region that was the American Southwest. I think I've said this before, but do not believe a single story about how the violence was overblown. I don't think that narrative is pushed anymore, but it sure was 15 years ago when I was in college. If you are wondering who shot Patron in the back, well, it was, allegedly, John Riley, who was partners with James Dolan, the same Dolan that McSween worked for as an attorney, the same Dolan that bought stolen animals from the boys who robbed them from Chisholm and whomever else they could. Dolan also bought animals that were stolen from Tunstall, McSween, and Brewer. It'll all become clear soon enough when I talk about the Santa Fe ring and the Lincoln County house. Once Tunstall and Patron arrived in the city of Lincoln in early November, Patron had to go off and do some politicking, as he was running for county commissioner and voting was the following day. Patron won that election, and so did a certain Sheriff William Brady. I keep saying this, but more on him later. So, Lincoln. It is north of today's Ruidoso and Ruidoso Downs, and north of the main Sacramento mountain range. It's also south of the beautiful Capitan Mountains, which strangely go east and west instead of north and south. The town, at this time, in the 1870s, it had less than 300 people, but it would forever become a legendary small town. Over the next few days, Tunstall roamed the streets and got to know a few locals before he finally went to the house of the McSweens and met McSween's wife. He had this to say about her to his father. He wrote that she was a, quote, very pleasant woman in every way. She told me as much about the place as any man could have done. She is the only white woman here and has a good many enemies in consequence of her husband's profession. End quote. I did read a little bit that Tunstall was kind of sweet on McSween's wife, but nothing ever happened. Don't worry about that. So her husband's profession, remember, was an attorney. Was the attorney, the only attorney. So you can't blame the people of Lincoln for not liking her husband very much because, he's a lawyer. But they will eventually come to think of McSween fondly, the town. Except for those sided with the house. Partially, what made people not like him very much was that he worked for Dolan and Riley in the house. Although he wouldn't for much longer. Actually, by the time he got back, he wouldn't really. Once he returns from New York City. In probably the same letter to his father, or actually his father and his mother and his sisters, a group which Tunstall would call his quote-unquote much-beloved Trinity, and I love that. I like Tunstall. He seemed like a very nice fella, and it's a shame. In a letter to his much-beloved Trinity, Tunstall talks about Lincoln. He describes it, and he describes a conversation which he had with some unnamed man. He wrote that Lincoln is a, quote, small collection of adobe houses scattered up a pretty creek called the Rio Bonito, which means pretty river, and is in miners' parlance about the toughest little spot in America, which means the most lawless. A man can commit murder here with impunity. And talking of a man who had shot another here the other day for calling him a gringo, much the same as calling a Frenchman a frog, the shooter afterwards rode quietly up the town and told the sheriff he would like to see the man who could capture him. I said, in this conversation with some unknown man, I said, he is rather bad medicine, I guess. The man I was talking to replied, "Who? Ham Mills? No, not a bit of it. You never saw a better fellow than Ham anywhere. He gets mad quick and shoots quick, but he's a good shot and never cripples. None of his men, victims, have ever known what hurt him. And I really think he is sorry for it afterwards when he cools off." End all quotes. And that right there perfectly sums up Lincoln. Because Ham Mills was once the sheriff. I think I'll talk about that later. Despite the stories and the seeming lawlessness and the rather rural nature of Lincoln, Tunstall fatefully and excitedly decided he'd like to stick around. A month and a half later in December, Alexander, or as he was known, Alex McSween, returned from New York City, and the two men immediately began to set up a rival to the hated, corrupt, and dangerous Lincoln County House, aka the House. It is now time to talk about the Santa Fe Ring and the House. The Santa Fe Ring began to form immediately after the Civil War, and it was led by two men, future Senator and Secretary of War Stephen Benton Elkins and future Senator Thomas B. Catrone. Maurice Fulton writes of Catrone in History of the Lincoln County War and says of him, quote, "He had a dominating personality, not to say ruthless. And during the 1870s, as well as a decade and a half longer, he was virtually dictator of New Mexico, politically, commercially, and professionally." End quote. The Santa Fe Ring could have its own series, really, but the Santa Fe Ring was a political machine that controlled the territory of New Mexico from the close of the Civil War until 1912. It was Union veteran and Republican led. Well, except for Catrone, actually. He was a Confederate Democrat who switched to the Republican side when he realized that was the only way to gain power. The Republicans had almost complete control over the politics of the entire nation after their war against the South, but especially out west. Nearly every prominent politician, judge, lawman, and prominent Hispanic family were all involved in the ring in New Mexico. Their main goal was to use whatever means necessary to gain as much wealth, power, and most importantly, land that they could in the territory. They turned a blind eye to corruption, but more often than not, they participated and facilitated said corruption. An affiliate ring naturally controlled Lincoln County. Lincoln County was, after all, the largest county in the nation at that time. The members of this ring were Yankee veteran Major Lawrence Gustav Murphy and his German partner, Colonel Emil Fritz. They formed L.G. Murphy & Co. And they formed that pretty much as soon as the Civil War had ended, and after they were discharged from Fort Stanton. And Fort Stanton is just 9 miles west of Lincoln. L.G. Murphy & Co. would invent titles and deeds to land that they did not own, and then sell said land to people arriving in the vast Lincoln County. If the newcomers missed any payments, L.G. Murphy & Co. would foreclose on their land and take it and all their possessions, including their cattle. They also got a lucrative contract to feed the Mescaleros, the Apaches, and the soldiers at Fort Stanton, who were charged with keeping the Apaches at bay. L.G. Murphy & Co. did not mind buying or acquiring stolen cattle, and often encouraged cattle rustling. Eventually, the Irishman Murphy hired the Irishman James Dolan, who brought with him his business partner, Irishman John H. Riley. Dolan had come over from Ireland when he was 6 years old. He then joined the Union Army as a drummer boy. And he was short. He was very short. 5 feet and 2 inches tall. But as Gardner writes, his temper was even shorter. Soon, L.G. Murphy & Co. had a monopoly on food and supplies and land in Lincoln County. They called themselves the House. One Lincoln Town resident later said of the House, quote, "Untold suffering has been endured by the people of Lincoln County at the hands of this firm, they being the only or principal merchants in the county. The people were obliged to buy goods of them at exorbitant prices and terms on their produce at Fort Stanton at prices to suit L.G. Murphy & Co., who had a monopoly of contracts, military, and Indians." End quote. Another Lincoln Town resident said of them, quote, "L.G. Murphy controlled everything that there was any money in and dictated who should run for office and who should not." End quote. And that office, or one of those offices, included sheriff. Murphy was not a man to be messed with. Matthews outlines a scene that occurred in 1875, and he outlines this scene to hammer that point home. He wrote, quote, "During the 1875 Lincoln County political convention, angered by opposition to his proposed candidates for county offices, hot-tempered Murphy exploded, overthrew the table, destroyed the stationery, and screamed, quote, 'You might as well try to stop the waves of the ocean with a fork as to try and oppose me.' End all quotes. In 1873, though, the German Fritz, he headed to New York. He took out a $10,000 life insurance policy and then headed to Stuttgart, Germany, to be with his family. Fritz designated his brother and sister as his heirs and beneficiaries. They both lived in New Mexico. Fritz would die in 1874, which meant the life insurance policy he had taken out needed to be paid. Naturally, McSween, the attorney for L.G. Murphy & Co., soon to be the James J. Dolan & Company, McSween was the man to bring that payment from New York to Lincoln County. By now, Dolan had somehow insinuated himself as a beneficiary of the life insurance policy, and he said that Fritz owed him money. McSween did not in any way want to give the money to Dolan. He wanted, as he was instructed and entrusted to do, he wanted to give the money to the Fritz family, his brother and sister. So by 1877, Fritz was dead, Murphy, at only 47, was dying, and Dolan and Riley now owned the house. And the house was a physical building, as well as a metaphorical one. The house had a nice second-story balcony that overlooked the town of Lincoln. I can picture the two on the balcony watching over the peasants as they stole from them, as they had a corrupt sheriff elected over them, Brady, and as they ran their own business into the ground. One more thing about the house. Dolan and Riley were Irish Catholics. This new man in town, Tunstall, was an English Protestant. And McSween was a Scotsman born in Canada who was also a Protestant. There was deep-rooted bad blood already behind this coming feud. So now that we've set up the ring in the house, the opposition faction to our story, let's get back to Tunstall and McSween. After McSween had returned from the East with the $7,000 check, because the company McSween had used and hired to get the money from the life insurance company, they took their fair share. But after McSween returned, he introduced Tunstall to Richard, or as we've been calling him, Dick Brewer. Brewer lived and operated about 10 miles south on the Rio Ruidoso. He had a ranch that he was leasing from the aforementioned Lawrence Murphy of the house. The thing is, McSween knew, since he had been their attorney for some time, McSween knew that the land that Brewer was leasing from Murphy and Dolan, he knew they didn't actually have the deed. They'd lied, they invented it. That's how they'd made so much money up to this point, and that's why Dolan and Riley were driving their business down to the ground, because they weren't able to sell any more false titles. Around this time, Brewer, under McSween's guidance, decided to stop paying for the lease, and he subsequently joined Tunstall and McSween in Chisholm. Obviously, Dolan did not like this, and he went over to Brewer's ranch with men, rifles, and pistols. Fulton describes the scene that unfolded. He wrote, quote, "When Brewer's defection was noticed by the Dolan people, they determined to put the screws to him in their Lincoln County style. Dolan, Billy Matthews, and Billy Morton, impressively armed with rifles and pistols, rode over to Brewer's ranch to demand that he either leave the ranch or pay for it as agreed. Brewer, acting under McSween's instructions, told them they had no title to the land, but they could have it if they would pay for the improvements he had put on it. Dolan angrily declined the proposal and told Brewer that if the ranch was not turned over, he would make it, quote, a personal matter with him, end quote. An expression in those times with unequivocal meaning. Brewer replied, "I know my rights, and if necessary, will defend them. I am not hunting a fuss, but I won't run from one." Dolan's departing bluster was, quote, "If you don't turn the ranch over, you will damn soon find your fuss." End all quotes. Brewer eventually took Tunstall on the Whiskey Trail, that's what it was known as, from Lincoln to his ranch, and the two became best friends. Yep. Tunstall would tell his father that Dick Brewer was, quote, "a great specimen of humanity, both physically and morally," end quote. Everyone seemed to like Tunstall. And to hell on a fast horse, Gardner describes Tunstall like this, quote, "His hair was sandy-colored and wavy, though well-groomed, and he sported chin whiskers and a pencil-thin mustache. In photographs, he appears as stiff and aristocratic as the man on the Prince Albert tobacco tins. But those close to the young Englishman thought he was good-looking and personable," end quote. Maurice Fulton, in History of the Lincoln County War, describes Tunstall even better. He wrote of him, quote, "Tunstall was a frank, friendly person who fitted in well with the community. While his ways and ideals were different, he nevertheless won confidence pretty generally. Some smiled at his English mannerisms and peculiarities, but his genuine friendliness and democratic attitude kept him from becoming the butt of ridicule, as an Englishman so frequently was on the frontier. His sense of honesty and fair play was ingrained and inflexible, best described as characteristically English or even sturdily mid-Victorian. He had inherited business ideals in the best tradition, which he did not intend to desert even in New Mexico, where business seemed to have lost all ethics in the mad scramble after wealth and power, and where opportunities were so limited that men adopted the most cutthroat methods." End quote. When Tunstall had arrived, he at first was going to buy property from Murphy and Dolan in the house, but McSween talked him out of it, since the house dealt in shady deeds. This only furthered the coming feud. Murphy would slander Tunstall to one of Tunstall's friends, and Tunstall would respond with, quote, "I'll tell you why they disapprove of me. They found I was not the sucker they thought I was when they tried to get me to buy one of their ranches. I told them I must have a title strong enough for my attorney, McSween, to approve. Since then, they have had little use for me, and now that I am going to start my store, they would like to get rid of me. But I'm in Lincoln to stay. You've heard about our English tenacity? Well, I have my share of it. I am going ahead with my store. If they make trouble, I'll not hesitate to show up their crookedness and general rottenness. They have oppressed this section long enough. I shall do all I can to lift their yoke from it." End quote. And them's some fighting words. It seemed everyone in Lincoln was beginning to bet against the house. Well, in early 1877, Tunstall and Brewer would head to the Pecos River to the east to get Tunstall some cattle. When they returned, McSween had bought 6 acres in the town of Lincoln from that same aforementioned Lawrence Murphy of the house. But by now, Murphy was dying, and he had handed over the house to Dolan and Riley. He still called many of the shots, though. I mean, he was the one that suggested Dolan should hire rustlers to disrupt Chisholm and then Tunstall. Murphy had cancer, though, and he was in poor health by this time, so he was no longer running his old company. But he still had influence, right up until he would die. Eventually, another man I mentioned in the beginning of this Lincoln County saga, a man named Robert Wideman, he would arrive and he would move in with Tunstall and Brewer. Tunstall wrote to his father that Wideman is, quote, a man I can depend upon and whom I like very much, end quote. Wideman plays an important role, though, and he has good connections back east. Connections that include the future Secretary of State. Author Matthews quotes some more letters from Tunstall to his father and his family. They're quite funny, and I'd like to read them now for y'all. Matthews writes, quote, soon after coming to Lincoln, Wideman moved in with Tunstall at Brewer's ranch. Tunstall told his father, my friend Wideman is a wonderful assistant. I am going to do my utmost to keep him around me. He is such a splendid fellow. He is one of the very few men of my own age, 24, that I ever cared a red cent about. He was educated in Germany and has traveled nearly all over Germany on foot. He speaks French nearly as well as I do. German, perfectly. He is a, quote, very smart fellow and as nice a dispositioned man as any man I ever met. He stands 6 feet and is very broad. He weighs 175 pounds and is 25 years old, end quote. Tunstall assured his father that, should anything happen to me, you will find that he can put you up to all the points necessary to pick up all my business so as not to lose anything. I think myself very lucky to have met him. The two friends bunked together at Brewer's. Tunstall was a sound sleeper. Wideman was not. Quote, I sleep every night like a rock and snore like a grampus from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. Wideman does not sleep very well and is, I think, a musician and lies in bed and listens to my solos on the bass viol until he can't stand it any longer. He then punches me in the ribs or anywhere else that comes handy and tells me he wants to go to sleep. All right, old fella, it's a free country, go ahead, I tell him, and turn over and pitch it a key lower down. In the morning, he blows up about my snoring, but I tell him I have only got his word for it, as I did not remember waking up after I said good night. Well then, you're a confounded galoot, he says, and we change the subject. Wideman is in the position of a friend at present, but I shall make some business arrangement with him as soon as I start into anything. End all quotes. So things are going pretty great for this new little group of ranching friends in Lincoln County. Now they just had to grow their business. And Tunstall had plans. He wrote to his father and told him he was making a quote-unquote ring, and that he wanted to get half of every dollar made in Lincoln County by anyone, anywhere. He wasn't ignorant of the house and its ring, but he felt like he and his buddies could make a dent and give some relief to the people at presently being swindled and held under the heel of the current house ring. On March 3rd, 1877, the United States Congress passed the Desert Land Act, in which any American man over the age of 21 could receive 640 acres of arid desert land if they promised to irrigate it and improve it. Similar to the Homestead Act. Well, Tunstall took advantage of this, and he applied for 4,000 acres southeast of the town of Lincoln. He couldn't personally take advantage on account of him being British, so he sent 6 Lincoln County men and friends, including Dick Brewer and Alexander McSween, to secure the land titles for him. It was a bit of a stretch in regards to the law, but they had plans. With the land secured, Tunstall went and purchased 209 heads of cattle. Where did he get the cattle from? Well, the previously mentioned Miss Casey, who was trying to get her 400 heads to Texas, where she'd sell them and pay off her debts. The law, or Brewer, caught up to her, though, and 209 of the 400 were auctioned off. Tunstall bought all 209 and eventually moved them to his many acres along the Rio Feliz, which is west of Roswell and Artesia and east of the Sacramento Mountains. So in this general Pecos River Valley region of Lincoln County. With the land and the cattle purchased, and with his friends running the various acreage, Tunstall and McSween then opened a store in Lincoln proper. He hired one of the 6 who had got a claim for him, a man named Sam Corbett, I don't know, I'm just going to say Sam Corbett, to run the store. Weidman also helped to look after the store. When Dolan of the house saw the store being built, he remarked rather sinisterly, quote, "They'll never do much business in that store," end quote. At least if Dolan got his way. Opening a store in Lincoln to rival the house was rather a bold move, and the fact that John and McSween teamed up further provoked the house. At the same time, John and McSween were plotting to open a bank. At this time in the territory, there was no bank in southern New Mexico, and there were only 2 banks at most in the entire territory. And the largest bank was in Santa Fe, and obviously owned by the Santa Fe Ring, specifically Elkins and Catrone. When McSween and Tunstall finally opened the bank, it was called the Lincoln County Bank, and the officers were John Chisholm, president, Alexander A. McSween, vice president, and John H. Tunstall, cashier. And to add even further injury to the ring itself, McSween was thinking of running for representative of the territory in Washington, which Catrone of the ring had his own eyes set on. John Tunstall and Alex McSween were quickly making enemies of the wrong people in Lincoln County, and the entire territory at large. After opening the store and the bank, and buying the land and cattle, Tunstall headed to St. Louis to buy goods with which to stock the enterprising store. But on his way home, he got smallpox. Dick Brewer, his friend and fellow rancher, he had earlier had smallpox. He'd actually contracted it when Tunstall and Brewer had headed east and down the mountain range together, down to the Pecos River to buy some cattle. It seems Brewer passed the virus along to Tunstall. Brewer had recovered, though, and Tunstall was attempting to do the same in Las Vegas on his return from St. Louis. But while in bed in Las Vegas, Tunstall received the news that I opened this episode with. His, Brewer's, and McSween's horses had been stolen by Evans and the boys. Undaunted by whatever was ailing him, Tunstall rode hard, 40 miles a day, to Lincoln once he received the news. He arrived on October 14th, 1877. Now, by October of that year, if you'll recall, Brewer had hired on to work for Tunstall the young man named William Bonney, a.k.a. Henry Antrim, a.k.a. Henry McCarty, soon to be Billy the Kid. The 17-year-old was about to be thrown into one of the most famous and violent feuds in the American Southwest, a feud that would forever cement him as one of the most infamous killers and outlaws in the nation's history. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, to track a killer lion, lost his fear, man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, was gone out of sound. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters, so could chase and fall. Now the lever action rifle and horses change the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me. The chase still feels the same. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good gyp sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed the mighty lion. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.